right, next up, we will hear from a panel of experts on the historic architecture of our city. Art and architectural historian Ann Mason is the former assistant director of the Masters in Historic Preservation program at Tulane University, as well as the former director of Preservation Research Center at the Herman Grimme and Geller Historic Houses. She has been a consultant for several local cultural institutions and was an organizer of the Cultural Tourism Symposium with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Lafayette native Tara Dudley obtained both her master's degree in historic preservation and her PhD in architectural history from the University of Texas at Austin, where she is currently a professor. Dudley's present scholarship and research is based on her dissertation titled Ownership, Engagement, and Entrepreneurship, the Gens de Couleur Labrie, and the Architecture on Antebellum New Orleans, 1820 to 1850. John Ethan Hankins is the founding executive director of New Orleans Mastercraft Guild. He is the former director of the New Orleans African American Museum and also curated at NOMA the award-winning exhibition titled Raised to the Trade, Creole Building Arts of New Orleans. Mr. Hankins is an advocate for the need to revive traditional building trade skills in post-Katrina New Orleans. Please join me in welcoming the panelists.
Hello, am I on? Can y'all hear me? Okay. These things are so intimidating a little bit. Is that better? I asked them if I should hold it and they told me no, but I think I'm gonna just hold it anyway. Okay. For me, it's particularly a privilege to be here. As Dr. DeQueer stated, I am from Lafayette, so it's always fun to come home, and we cook, but it's nice to, stop along the way and, have pork ribs and etouffee and red beans and rice at home. I've eaten already too much in the last couple of days, so hopefully that doesn't affect my talk today. But, I'm not going to nod off, as I have the itis. So I actually didn't have too much this morning, just some fruit, so I'm good for now. But, it's just always exciting to come home, and New Orleans has a special place in my heart, even though I wasn't born and raised here. And being here at Xavier University is also particularly exciting for me. I'm being founded by St. Catherine Drexel. The elementary school that I went to in Broussard, Louisiana was Catherine Drexel Elementary. So all of these, circular things and coming home. And then I just have to also give another little shout out to Dr. DeQueer. We're classmates and graduated together from Lafayette High School. So I thank her and the committee for inviting us here today. But I will not thank them for the very daunting task of trying to talk about 300 years of New Orleans architecture in 45 minutes. That's virtually impossible. And so to talk about architecture and the idea of home and architecture as home, again, a very daunting task and not an easily one. And we could have easily, between the three of us, commandeered the entire weekend just to talk about architecture. But we will, stay within the confines that they have given us. And so what is architecture? The art or practice of designing and constructing buildings, or just the manner in which a building is designed or constructed, specifically with regard to a period, place, or time or culture. And as we know, New Orleans architecture is very rich, and the specificity of that architecture going from the founding days to the current times, from St. Louis Cathedral to the Superdome, is quite impressive. And the idea of home. Typically, when we think of home, we think of a building, the place where we live. And so it's kind of easy to make architecture and home and relate that way, but it's not that simple, it's not that easy. And so our job and what we're going to attempt to do today is to kind of simplify those ideas over the course of 300 years. There are many, many groups that have contributed to the very rich history of New Orleans architecture and this idea of a creation of home, making New Orleans home through the built work, French engineers, Spanish architects, builders and craftsmen of color, enslaved laborers, Irish and German immigrants, and on and on and on. We're all familiar with names like Henry Howard, James Gallier, Benjamin Latrobe, Barthélemy Lafont, Jacques Danès, on, you know, and the list just goes on and on. But what we're going to do, attempt to do today is to remember some of those individuals, those names, those ideas and efforts that are forgotten, that are less remembered over the course of time. And so Anne Masson, who we know has an impressive scholarship and just civic and professional body of work and with historic preservation, and her work at Tulane, is going to talk to us today about the contribution of French military engineers whose early buildings of New Orleans were designed by engineers. And it was their technical knowledge and training, their European knowledge, that enabled to adapt European building practices to a different environment, to a different climate. And their designs literally serve as the building foundation for New Orleans. I myself am going to talk about the contributions of the gens de couleur libre on the architecture of antebellum New Orleans. And I do that by focusing very specifically on two families, as you will later note. And then we have with us Mr. Ethan Hankins, whose current work as the executive director of the New Orleans Mastercraft Guild grew out of his book, Raised to the Trade. And today, this morning, he'll present us with a modern view of architecture, taking some of these ideas from the 19th century and 18th century that we'll talk about in these individuals, and talk about them particularly in regards today to craftsmen and how we take those traditions and move them forward, and how we continue to train craftsmen so that we can maintain the body of architecture and work that we have here in New Orleans. So without further ado, Ms. Masson.
Thank you, Tara. Good morning. I am really honored to be here and so happy to be able to talk about these French military engineers. Some of you may be acquainted with them already, but they are really forgotten men, even though their legacy to us is quite profound. Just an introduction, and I hope it will pique your interest to see some of the wonderful drawings that are on display at the Historic New Orleans Collection and also in the book, Founding Era. So you can really get a feel for their drawing skills. I really couldn't stand up here today without mentioning the name of Sam Wilson. He was the preservationist, scholar, architect extraordinaire, and writer about colonial Louisiana. He is the person who discovered in the French archives in the 1930s many of the drawings that you're going to be able to see today, and did an enormous amount of research about the men and the buildings. He remains to this day the great expert on colonial Louisiana, but unfortunately he's no longer with us, so I'll try to do him just a little bit of justice. These men that we think little of today, and their names, some of their names are on the screen, really carved out of a virgin forest and stands of roseau cane, a frontier settlement that established French control of the Mississippi Valley and also grew to be our home. They built levees, constructed fortifications, designed buildings, drained swamps, and established brickyards. They overcame floods, hurricanes, disease, all sorts of perilous conditions, alligators and snakes, of course, to create the plan of New Orleans and to build its first buildings. It was a very difficult posting. By 1726, the first 3 engineers working in New Orleans had died. The cornerstone of the city's engineering foundation was Adrien de Pouget, whose determination to create a well-planned, regular city was so strong that in 1722, he came to blows with a settler who opposed his street alignments. Along with engineer-in-chief Leblanc de Latour, he devised the grid plan for the city, drawing on 17th century French military engineering concepts, on early 16th century precepts for building the cities of New Spain, and on Renaissance ideals of regularity and order. De Pouget arrived in Louisiana in October 1720, bringing with him 64 workers he had recruited with great difficulty in France. His assertion that ships could actually pass through the dangerous passages and sandbars and other obstructions at the mouth of the Mississippi River was pivotal in the decision to locate the capital here. One of Dupoget's first efforts was the installation of a 62-foot beacon signaling the entrance to the river. It was called La Balise, and that name persisted at the settlement. And he also installed buoys to mark the passages, the first ones known in the United States. Thus, he opened up the river and New Orleans to trade. On March 29, 1721, Dupoget arrived at New Orleans, then no more than a collection of miserable huts gathered at the river's edge near where Conti Street is today. Although a small clearing had been made by Bienville when he selected the site in 1718, Dupoget's first task was to prepare sufficient land to lay out the streets. The first workmen were convicts who quickly abandoned the effort and were replaced by 10 soldiers and an officer who, according to Dupoget, worked so swiftly for 12 days that they made sufficient clearings for tracing all the streets on the riverfront. Think of the swamp here. Think of the trees. 12 days is not much. But due to shortages, some of the earliest workers were paid in brandy, a real New Orleans thing, I guess, 1/4 pint per day. In order to construct substantial buildings in the wilderness, the engineers continually requested workmen as skilled workmen from France and other parts of Europe, but they were continually disappointed in their requests. In 1720, they were promised and probably did not receive the following: 6 carpenters, 12 joiners, 7 locksmiths, 3 edge tool makers, 2 smiths, 2 nail makers, 5 brick makers, 9 masons, a cooper, a wheelwright, and a pit sawer. Tile makers, lime burners, cabinet makers, and roof slaters and turners came within the next few years. This gives you an idea of the enormous skilled craftsmen, the enormous variety of people that they needed to build these first structures. The engineers also secured building materials, such as the 1,530 pounds of iron needed for hardware at the warehouse. The engineers working in early Louisiana trained in the Corps de Génie, the first European building organization of national scope. Fueled by continuous warfare and informed by the genius of the Marquis de Vauban, the Corps turned out well-trained, educated engineers who could tackle building both fortifications and civic structures. In addition to mathematics and geometry, the engineers acquired skills in cartography, surveying, and drawing. They understood hydraulics, mechanics, and construction. They mastered the problems of building earthworks, roads, bridges, and canals. All these skills were put to use in New Orleans, where the engineers encountered innumerable difficulties in establishing the new settlement. When laying out New Orleans, the engineers relied on their training to choose the most favorable situation. One of their goals was to create symmetry in circumstances where this seemed impossible. So Dupoget located the planned city right at the bend of the river that enabled settlers to see who was approaching, either friend or foe. Based in Baroque planning principles, it was a defensive position that was also good for moorage. To mitigate the danger of flooding, levee construction began almost immediately. With the knowledge of earthen building, the engineers ordered that willow trees be planted along the river's edge to prevent erosion. And of course, the descendants of those willow trees are still there today. Dupoget also moved the town grid closer to the river than had been planned to take advantage of the higher ground and the breezes found there, a very smart decision. The town's grid plan exemplifies the idea that towns should be planned and planned rationally as urban spaces that allowed the free circulation of air, water, men, and vehicles. The Place d'Armes, now Jackson Square, flanked by governmental and religious buildings, was an ambitious composition forming the town's center. Other buildings were arranged nearby for convenience and utility. One, the powder magazine, was located somewhat upriver for safety, as the 1725 lightning strike on the warehouse in the center of town where the powder was being stored alarmed not only the officials but the citizenry who were afraid of a great explosion there. Despoget divided the town squares into 12 lots each. Many French Quarter properties retain these 300-year-old lot lines. When distributing land to the early settlers, he placed their houses close to the streets so that, in his words, each and every one may still have some land at the rear to make a garden, which here is half the life. One of the functions of military engineers in the colonial context was the drawing up of plans for important buildings and then supervising the construction of these buildings. But the engineers faced a challenging situation at the new site. There was no stone with which they were most accustomed to building, so they soon set up brickyards to supply materials for masonry construction. The difficulty was somewhat offset by the bounty of fine wood available nearby, especially cypress. As the land was cleared, the felled trees were hewn into heavy timber frames called colombage. These were filled in with brick, resulting in what we call brick between post construction, a local adaptation of French vernacular tradition. Usually planks or stucco covered the building's exteriors. This building, which was the very first Ursuline convent, they decided to leave the soft brick and the wood framing exposed. Thus, the building fell down in about 10 years. A new one was built, of course. French roof trusses supported steeply pitched hipped roofs that were covered in tile or cypress shakes, highly flammable cypress shakes, I might add. In the early 1720s, the engineers were already incorporating the galleries that have proved so useful for outdoor living. As the years passed, French engineers found new ways of adapting European building traditions to the situation in Louisiana, where damp, rot, and rising water were prevalent. So successful were their adaptations to the climate and available materials that builders have followed their examples nearly to the present day. Using relatively small architectural vocabulary, the engineers designed the parish church, the convent, administrative buildings, barracks, warehouses, a guardhouse, a jail, a horse and wind-powered mill, houses, kitchens, a hospital, and many other buildings. Although simple in design, the structures echoed the look of French architecture during the reign of Louis XIV. Of these early buildings, only one remains, the 1745 Ursuline Convent, the second Ursuline Convent. The influence of these engineers trickles down to our era. As we traverse the old city, known today as the Vieux Carré, we walk the street grid laid out by the engineers. We speak the names they gave to the cities, and we enjoy their fine square facing the river. The buildings themselves have long disappeared, but in the city's architecture we see ghosts of the engineers' ideas: practical raised basement houses, galleries for outdoor living, courtyard gardens, French doors and windows, and so many other things. So we have much to thank them for, and we should appreciate the travails through which they went to give us the home that we enjoy today. In 1722, the year after he arrived, when this was still basically a wilderness with huts, Despoget, who always believed in the future of the city, wrote, "New Orleans is growing before your eyes, and there is no longer any doubt that it is going to become a great city," which I think we all would agree with that. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you'll see these beautiful drawings. Thank you.
Okay, we're now going to jump ahead about 100 years in time, so welcome to time travel. Okay. The years from 1820 to 1850 saw New Orleans become an important American metropolis and industrialized shipping center. Those 3 decades provide a very challenging and fruitful framework in which to view the architectural-related contributions of the gens de couleur libre, or free people of color, on the architecture of antebellum New Orleans. During this time, New Orleans had a very stable economy, but changing racial hierarchies affected this group of people and their success in building, developing, and speculating. Still, their investments thrived in a city where racial separation was becoming increasingly strict, and they helped to retain Black and Creole control in the city. The gens de couleur libre were actors whose activities constituted an active property ownership and creation as they made New Orleans home. A symposium on its own really could honor the many contributions of this group of people, but it's individuals and families like the Doliols and the Souliers who are among whose building, purchasing, and selling activities are really interwoven into the fabric of New Orleans architecture. Brothers and natives of Provence, France, Louis-Antoine and Jean-François Doliol immigrated to New Orleans between 1763 and 1778 during the Spanish colonial period. The brothers both established long-term extramarital or plaçage relationships with women of color, becoming white patriarchs of mixed-race families. Louis became involved with 3 Black women, Geneviève Laronde. Their children, his 3 sons in particular, owned significant amounts of property in the Vieux-Carré and Faubourg Treme, often improving them with buildings that they constructed, if not commissioned. Eulalie Masange, or Vivante, was a quadroon descended from a family of color established in New Orleans in the mid to late 1700s. She was the long-term consort of Jean Soulier, a native of France and member of the New Orleans militia, who also held positions in New Orleans as a city recorder. Eulalie and Jean had 8 children who lived to adulthood. All of the children were owners and managed a significant amount of property in New Orleans, but it's the sons in particular, Norbert, Albin, and Bernard, who were influential builders. By the time of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and the events surrounding the Haitian Revolution began to impact the city in the first decade of the 1800s, both the Doliol and Soulier families were already very well established. The means through which the Doliols and Souliers came into contact with and claimed and impacted the built environment were very important. And it's this process of ownership, possession, and entrepreneurship that I focused on in my dissertation. But it really resulted in the creation of home places in many deliberate ways for these people. White Creole men or European immigrants like Louis Doliol circumvented legal limitations by making arrangements for their mixed-race children to acquire the property that they owned. Louis did this both during his lifetime and at his death by either providing them with the necessary funds or making the property available through third-party purchase, since he couldn't bequeath the property directly to his children. Geneviève Doliol, his consort, and her children also purchased property independently, then combined it or amongst themselves or divided it to create enclaves on St. Philippe Street, both north and south of Rampart Street. In this way, the Doliol's efforts emphasized the importance of property ownership as a birthright. They used their family-owned properties to fund home building for themselves and for other families of color over several generations. In a few instances, the Souliers also purchased and built home for themselves, but for them, that ownership came primarily through contractual transactions with neighbors and strangers. And it's this process of acquisition by obtaining property for themselves. It might appear to emphasize independent efforts, but really serve to create birthright for themselves through these contracts. And the Soulier siblings worked together and for one another to obtain property in such large numbers that they created their own birthright. Here on this map, I've illustrated the combined properties owned at some time or another by the Doliols and the Soulier families, and it shows the sheer number of known properties that they possessed during the antebellum period, some for personal use and development, some for sale and speculation. But it also reveals that the free people of color owned property throughout the city. The Souliers, for example, owned property in the areas that we now know as the Garden District and the Holy Cross neighborhood. And their selection of locales was very deliberate for building and developing properties, but it was based on personal choice, also on economic opportunity for, even though the city was divided by racial and geographic divisions. As I mentioned, the men in these families were also very well-known builders during this time. Jean-Louis Doliot, Joseph Doliot, and Bernard Soulier were among those builders who perfected, namely the Creole cottage, adapting the form to unique property situations and client needs. Native New Orleanians, such as the Doliots and the Souliers, were much more responsible for its introduction, proliferation, and persistence than their counterparts who immigrated from Saint-Domingue during and after the Haitian Revolution. On the other hand, Norbert Soulier's repertoire consisted primarily of taller building forms, the Creole townhouse and the Anglo-influenced townhouse. The one non-residential form built by a member of either family was the Greek Revival style Louisiana sugar refinery that Norbert commenced with his first cousin, Edmond Rieux, the brother of engineer Norbert Rieux, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. These gens de couleur libre deliberately chose to retain traditional Creole forms developed before the antebellum period, even as the city grew and you had more Americanized traditions coming in from the East Coast, and as other builders increasingly turned to the shotgun tradition. The privileges that the Doliots and Souliers enjoyed as freemen, as well as their reputation in the white Creole and Anglo communities via their familial associations, their relationships with clientele, greatly enhanced their professional lives, allowing them to own real estate, enter into business contracts, lease property, and trade on the open market. And it's by these means that they acquired wealth and became pillars of their communities, exerting a measure of control not seen in many other antebellum communities of free persons of color. While not as wealthy as the Souliers, the Doliots exerted control in their personal and business relationships with other gens de couleur libre. They had familial ties to lots of other builders and often served as estate appraisers and executors. The business of property ownership and building speculation is clearly spelled out in the Soulier family ledgers. I took economics in high school. I've never was more excited to look at account books than when I came across these ledger books in the Williams Research Center at the Historic New Orleans Collection. And here we're looking at a page from one of those ledger books, as well as a photograph and map details showing the location of one of the Soulier's many rental properties throughout the city. And their income from rental properties made the Souliers some of the wealthiest gens de couleur libre, as consistently illustrated not only in these ledgers, but other documents such as marriage contracts, property value sheets, their credit rating documents, tax registers, estate files, probate records. The documentation that really shows the involvement, the extent to which these families were involved is very rich. And as Sophie White talked about yesterday, just the documentation exists, but you have these different kinds of voices that come out, particularly in relation to their architectural contributions in these kinds of documents. And so you really see that kind of rich development. And it's through their building and real estate activities that the gens de couleur libre really established and exploited not only personal, but professional relationships to ensure individual economic success and the perseverance and preservation of the community of people of color when it was rapidly changing in the antebellum era. And the Doliots and the Souliers are only two of the many, many families and individuals of free people of color who have rarely been appreciated as the architects, not just builders and craftsmen, but architects that they truly were. In too many cases, the buildings and neighborhoods of free men and women of color are all we have that serve as sort of portraits and biographies of these individuals. But families such as the Doliots still have descendants who call New Orleans home. Louis Antoine's male progeny didn't have descendants, but his brother did, and that family is still very active in the New Orleans community, participating in civic activity. They're members of St. Augustine Church in Tremé. But on the other hand, the Soulier family in my research kind of disappeared for a while. Bernard Soulier was the last of his siblings to leave New Orleans in 1875 to return to the country of their father's birth and reside permanently in Paris. His other brothers and siblings had left New Orleans in the 1830s and 1840s. But due to the power of the internet, some magic happened. And I was always asked, I have all these pictures of buildings and documents, and people were always asking, do you have portraits or photographs of any of these individuals? And for a long time, I was only able to say, no, sorry, I don't. And it just killed me that I didn't know what any of these people looked like, even though I'm an architectural historian and I can go on and on about the buildings. But in November of 2016, I received a surprise email from a Soulier descendant. And today, I'm pleased to have in the audience Bernard's great-great-grandson, Norbert Soulier, and his wife, Raphael. And he provided me with these photographs, these portraits of this family member, and we welcome you to New Orleans and are excited that you've returned home 143 years after Norbert left to join us for this tricentennial celebration. New Orleans gens de couleur libre claimed privilege through the built environment and manipulated property ownership and development as a tool to define individual and communal identity. They created a lasting impact on the architectural heritage of New Orleans. Though not considered architects by mainstream American architectural history, they really were. They were the quintessential master builders who, within the gens de couleur libre community, possessed the status and prestige sought by architects, both black and white at large. They were the architects, the planners and creators of an architectural identity that is central to the struggles and tensions inherent in American history and American architecture. They were the architects of an architectural legacy without which there would be no New Orleans 300 years later. Thank you. Got her up.
Good morning. The time travel continues. We're going to jump ahead now another 100 years to the. Okay. All right. All right. And now that sound has accompanied this travel. All right. My name is Ethan Hankins, and I'm the executive director of the New Orleans Mastercraft Guild. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what is the state of the trades that maintain the city today and move us forward into the 21st century. Treme and the 7th Ward neighborhoods are the epicenters of the unique African American and Creole building trade traditions and home to the legendary families of free men of color who worked as master craftsmen who helped build New Orleans. Their traditional building trade traditions are historically significant in that New Orleans is one of the few American cities where significant communities of free and enslaved people of colors achieved such preeminent positions in the preservation building trades. For almost 3 centuries, trade skills unique to New Orleans' architecture have been passed along through families as new generations learn from family members, community mentors, union trainers, and vocational education instructors. These traditions are disappearing now as many of the venerable master plasterers, master masons, master carpenters, and master blacksmith and ironworkers grow older without dedicated apprentices to continue their skills and cultural traditions. By the end of the 20th century, a long-term sustainability strategy was needed to revive the transmission of these trade skills into the 21st century. Nick Spitzer, who you all hear from a little bit later, likened the situation to the way venerable musicians like Danny Barker and Anthony Tubafats had led a revival of brass band music among the youth of New Orleans in the 1980s and 1990s. Realizing the scarcity of documentation from the craftsman's perspective and hoping to benefit from insiders' wisdoms, plans for collecting oral history narratives from the master craftsman began in the summer of 1998. Field recordings began during the summer of 1999 and continued through the summer of 2001. During that time, 55 interviews were conducted with master craftsmen of the building trades of New Orleans. These interviews were conducted by 12 field workers who mostly were graduate students from UNO and Tulane. And there was one from Xavier, too. The first summer sessions of recordings in 1999 were directed by Nick Spitzer, who developed a solid research design and trained the field workers. Beginning in the fall of 1999, Ray Brasseur assumed the duties of field director and continued in that capacity until the end of the summer of 2001. All 55 interviews, approximately 88 recorded hours, were transcribed, producing approximately 1,000 pages of transcript and thoroughly indexed. Now, the indexing is important because if you use this archive, you don't have to listen to 100 hours of audio tape to find out something that you want. So, by the way, back then we didn't have any type of AI to help us do this indexing. It was really painstaking, and it was done the old-fashioned way with typewriters and just pecking of words. The collection is now housed in the Special Collections Division of the Earl K. Long Library at the University of New Orleans. Excerpts from that collection can also be found online at the Louisiana Folklife Division's website. It's entitled More Than Just a Trade, Creole Building Craftsmen of the Building Trades. Master carpenters who told their rich family stories include Joseph Breaux, Sal Doucette, Sterling Doucette, Ivy Godet, Henry Geringer, Rudy Hutchinson, who's a great also duck carver, Russell Plessy from the famous Plessy family. They were all mostly woodworkers. Edwin Romaine, Kevin Cincino, and Evan Staunton. Master brick masons who told their rich life stories included Preston Collins, Irvin Fleming, DeSoto Jackson, who is quite a wordsmith, Wilbert Manette, Raphael Perot, Teddy Pierre, our resident poet, brick mason, who Teddy Pierre also was the first African-American to receive an architecture degree from Tulane University School of Architecture. But he really decided that his calling was to be a brick mason like his dad, who was legendary in the 20th century, one of the best masons ever produced in the Gulf South. Also, Jerry Reynolds and A.J. Pete Tucker. I'm calling out these names because people don't hear these names a lot. Some of my friends who are in the audience, when we speak these names, I mean, they're just warmth comes over us because these guys are real characters, as you might imagine. This is really true of plasterers, and we have some in the audience. Master plasterers who told their rich stories are Louis Alexander, the late great Earl Bartley, who I think almost everyone might know here, Amity Castanil, Herbert Getrich, who after Hurricane Katrina, Frontline did, I was fortunate to help Frontline do a 1-hour documentary on him. He was, by the way, that old man in the 9th Ward, that first man back, you remember that story? The guy who was the only man in the 9th Ward who rebuilt this house at 84, so that because his wife wanted to come back home from Milwaukee. He was also called the Wizard because he could just work magic with plaster. Tommy Lachine, who was an Italian, William Smitty Smith, Alan Sumas, who says he is the best fisherman ever. And Tevis, and he really was. One time, he used to always say this, one time he used to come to the museum all the time and would request personally that I come out of my office to meet him at the front door so he wouldn't have to pay to get in. But anyway, he's always telling me he's the best fisherman in the world. And one day he came there, and sure enough, they called me from the desk and said, Mr. Sumas is here to see you. I was like, please just let him in. He said, no, he wants to see you. And I went up, and he had a big package of fish like he normally brought. And he also had a magazine by the, what's the name of that fishing organization that has a big Gulf bass fishing organization? You know, you see it on the back of trucks. And they had named the 5 best fishermen in Louisiana. And lo and behold, Alan Sumas. And of course, we also interviewed Tevis Vandergrift because his dad, who is a prickly type, wouldn't talk himself. So Tevis spoke for him. Master Ladders, who have very, very rich stories. The Ladders are the people who make the infrastructure behind that support the plaster, include Vernon Abady and someone who you all might know, Allison Tootie Montana, who is the big chief of the Yellow Pocahontas, and who was probably the fastest man with a hammer and a nail in the 20th century in Louisiana. Seriously, I mean, he wouldn't have to tell you that, even though he would, but everybody else would say that. And to a person, even people who don't like Tootie would say that when that man would be in a room, you would think that there was like a whole gang of people working in there because he was so fast and he always nailed to a rhythm. And it was like a performance. It was like performance art. By the way, this, dome is in like a standard issue, 14-foot shotgun house in the 7th Ward that if you drove on that street, as a street of craftsmen, if you drove past that house, you would have no idea of what's inside, and it's all over town. And the last group that is like really rich are the Ironworkers, of which the two that are like are really keen are Donald Tudry and Master Blacksmith Darrell Reeves, who is also in the audience. All of this came together in an exhibition project and a book called Raised to the Trade, Creole Building Arts of New Orleans, which I was honored to be the program director of at the New Orleans Museum of Art in the year 2002. And thus began a 20-year immersion for me into the world of New Orleans master craftsmen. This has led to the creation of the New Orleans Mastercraft Guild. Now, I didn't do this alone. There was a core group of us who initially started it, included Master Plasterer Jeff Poirier, Master Blacksmith Darrell Reeves, and 2 young preservationists, Annie Irvin, who is now Executive Director of the Beauregard Kai's House, and Jenna Burke, who is Assistant Director of the Vieux Carré Property Owners and Resident Associates. The Mastercraft Guild exists primarily to help revive the disappearing community of masters of the building arts of New Orleans. The unique building arts traditions of New Orleans are disappearing because the venerable master craftsmen are aging and dying off. I attend too many funerals. Hurricane Katrina devastated many of the old master craftsmen who lacked sufficient insurance or cash reserves to make up for the loss of their tools, equipment, property, and the scattering of their employees, to all parts of the country. It was just devastating. It was just too much for them to make up to continue their independent businesses. By the way, it should be noted that many of the master craftsmen that I talk about are at the very top of the food chain, and they almost all are independent craftsmen. They're kind of like, hired guns. They don't like work for contractors. You don't like work for someone who is kind of inferior in talent to you if you are a real mechanic. They're just kind of like, the gunslingers of the building trades. As a matter of fact, they have an expression here in New Orleans that, cause you don't kind of get a certificate or a badge to be in this crew. You kind of are a part of this by kind of mutual, kind of self promotion. And so they have this expression that the top guys they always say, I was in the top 10 of my generation. So, for instance, if we gathered 11 of these guys into a room, all of them would be in the top 10. So, it's true. So anyway, right now, the Guild, we started the Guild in 2012. I won't bore you about all the details of how we organized it, but it was built around, like this core group, a handful of strong and healthy master craftsmen who are still at the pinnacle of their careers. Their training that they give to our apprentices exceeds anything available at area technical colleges, unions, and home builder programs. As a matter of fact, I recruit from the colleges, home builder programs, and other apprentice programs. So we are kind of, I like to say, the NBA all-stars of the building trades. And so it leverages the skills and vernacular cultural legacies of the master craftsmen, mentors, with interpersonal job readiness and professional development skills that lead to lifelong sustainable employment with family supporting wages. Right now, we have 2 skill tracks that we are currently offering. That's in the trial trades, that's like fine plastering, masonry, and tile setting, and ironwork, which is welding and blacksmithing. The ironwork is directed by Master Blacksmith Darryl Reeves, who is here. Darryl, you stand for a minute? Darryl is a 3rd-generation metal worker. He's also the owner of Andrew's Welding and Blacksmith Shop in New Orleans' 7th Ward. Growing up in a family of metal workers, Darryl worked at his father's awning company, but was first inspired to be a blacksmith by his maternal grandfather, who worked on St. Emma Plantation near Donaldsonville. Darryl is renowned for his work as a historical blacksmith, but is just as well known for his artistic endeavors. In fact, Darryl always precedes, he calls himself an artistic and historic blacksmith, and not the other way around. And these are some of the projects that our apprentices have worked on, the restoration of all the ironwork recently in the presbytere. They developed a really interesting way of restoring all of that ironwork there. So they're having too much fun on the scaffolding there. And this is an example of some of the many gates that you'll see of Darryl's work. It doesn't show up here, but if you look at the details down below, those are like, he does a lot of work with different types of metals, and he's able to color the metals so that you don't necessarily have to paint a lot of this stuff. He can fuse metals. All right, moving faster now. The master plasterer, Jeff Poray, runs our trial trades program. Now, Jeff is a 5th-generation master plasterer. If you just do the math on that, and he's the patriarch of the legendary Poray family of plasterers. Jeff is the owner of Jeff Poray Plastering. Like Darryl, Jeff grew up in the 7th Ward. during a time when it was the tradition to pass down centuries-old trade skills from one generation to the next. And Jeff learned from the very, very, very best plasterers. The Poré family is legendary for their exceptional skills in ornamental exterior and interior plastic, artistic molds, and especially finishes, including Old World Venetian and exotic finishes. Jeff Poré Plastering maintains a full-time art shop and can restore almost any mold by working from fragments, photographs, or drawings. And Jeff is here too. Would you stand, Jeff? Jeff's shop is like, it's awesome in there. You want to take all this stuff home, but you can see they're working a lot of historic work. They do a lot of medallions. He can custom make anything that you might like, but he's pretty much a plasterer of record for many of the historic buildings and mansions and so forth in the city. If you get in Jeff's truck and drive down St. Charles Avenue in the Garden District, he's like, nah, that's my columns, those are my medallions. I'm just like, okay, I get the point. No, he's a very modest guy. So in addition to the historic stuff, they also do very new construction. If you all are familiar with the new Gold Ring mansion on St. Charles Avenue, we've had 4 apprentices to work on that project for almost 4 years, right, Jeff? Finally complete. Well, in any case, to wrap up, I just want to close by saying that, reiterating that the New Orleans Mastercraft Guild seeks to train the next generation of master craftsmen in the traditional building arts of New Orleans such that they can become, too, one of the top 10 in the city. As the late, great master plasterer Earl Barthay said, it's some precious work. Thank you.